Well, good afternoon. Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday. I am back. I was actually supposed to come and see you guys on yesterday, um, but I didn't. So I do apologize about not coming before you guys yesterday. But, I just got kind of sidetracked with work and had some other things going on. But I did not want too much time to pass in between me coming and talking to you guys. And so I will give people just an opportunity to join that are able to join. I know it's like a random time during the day, but I try to go live when I do have the ability to be able to do that. And so if you're catching this on the replay, definitely let me know when you watch this that you are watching this by replay. Let me know if this is helpful. And so we are going to wait just another minute or two, and we are going to be getting right into our discussion today. I realize that I really don't ever introduce myself, but I am going to start doing that a little bit more, as I will be. This is also streaming on YouTube, and you just never know who may hop on and like, well, who is this? And so, for those of you that do not know me, welcome. My name is Holly Brock. I am a licensed mental health therapist, but I am also a board certified clinician. And so, one of the things that I um, enjoy is being able to bridge the gap between our faith, being able to bridge the gap between church, but also mental health. We are a being that has a soul, but we also have a spirit. And I think sometimes when it comes to mental health in general, it can be one of those areas that the church can typically stay away from. I think some of that has to do with that there's just like maybe not enough. I don't want to say knowledge, but then sometimes that can just be it. Like people don't understand mental health, they don't understand mental illness, and so not really having the framework or the language to be able to discuss it. And so I have definitely spent a lot of time, in the field. I've been in mental health for over 20 years. And I have been saved since I was 16. So my faith in being a Jesus girl has all I've ever known. But I have found that sometimes, even in counseling sessions, people find it difficult to bridge the gap between their soul and their spirit, um, between what goes on regarding their mental health, but also what does the Bible say. And so that's why I like to come on and just do teachings, just to give you a different perspective, give you insight about different things that we experience, so that you have an understanding. But also, I'm always open to feedback, I'm always open to questions. And so, if you're hopping on as you join, if there's something that I discussed that you would like more information about, feel free to talk to me in the chat. If I am discussing something that is like, okay, Holly, that you talking to me, let me know that you are listening, and that this is helpful. Also, if you're like, man, I really need to do more work, in my soul, because maybe I have experienced trauma, you can check out my website and schedule a free consult, because like I said, I'm also a licensed mental health therapist. So I also, do this like for real, for real. And so again, so we're gonna get right into it. I spent like 5 minutes just boring you with my jabber. So, if you have been following me at all for like the last couple of weeks, I started kind of like a dialogue on inner healing, going back and healing the inner child. And the reason that I started that, it was coming up a lot in some of the counseling sessions that I do. It was all about going back and healing the inner child. And so I took that as a sign that if those are people that I'm meeting on a regular basis who needed help with navigating that internal healing, what it means to go back and heal the inner child, that I knew that there were other people who follow me, who I know, who may come across an Instagram reel, who that information is also beneficial. And so, what I'm going to be doing today is just somewhat continuing that dialogue. We've been talking about inner healing. This is going to be like a 3-part series. It sounds kind of cool to say we're going to do a series, right? But it's like 3 parts because I can talk about this stuff all day. And I've realized that just because I get it and it makes sense to me, giving that information out to others where what they're hearing is brand new, it can be so overwhelming. It can be too much. So I'm trying to be better with not giving you like a mental overload with just all of the things that I have to say. So I've broken this up into 3 parts. So today we are going to be talking about just the basics of inner healing and what it means to be on a journey to wholeness. So I'm looking kind of out across because that's where my second screen is at. So I'll be going back and forth. So again, if you are taking notes, or if you're watching this, again by replay, make sure you take notes because I believe that the information in here will be beneficial. It will help you maybe understand what goes on in your soul when you're wounded, but also give you practical steps to help you begin to move forward. Many adults spend their lives circling around wounds. I think therapy now is the thing that everybody's doing, which I, as a mental health professional, it makes my heart proud to know that I believe like the younger generations are embracing therapy, but there are some of us who are older who could benefit from being able to sit down and talk to somebody about those things that they never discussed because it still impacts them today. Again, some of the things that I've been posting lately has been about, the wounded inner child and how a lot of our adult behaviors are definitely directly related to those experiences that we had as a child, and we never went back and healed from them. We never went back and made sure that we closed those doors, and so we're walking around with wounds as an adult. It affects our ability to think clearly. It affects our ability to feel correctly. Being wounded, especially as a child, transcends all the way through our life, and so that's why it's so important to be willing to do the work with someone who you trust and who has experience so that you can definitely live your best life and not be bound by your wounds. All right, class, are y'all ready? Today we are talking about inner healing, journey to wholeness. All right. So 3rd John, 2nd chapter, this is the ESV version, and it says, "Beloved, I pray that all may go well with you and that you may be in good health as it goes well with your soul." So, when we think about the term wholeness in general, what does that mean? The term health and wellness are often used interchangeably. The World Health Organization, so WHO, everybody heard about WHO during COVID, right? It was the World Health Organization that was doing a lot of talk. They were the ones that were kind of on the forefront when COVID first happened. So that's who they are. So it's defined as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well being, and not merely the absence of an infirmity. Although wellness can be defined similarly, some suggest that wellness is more active and a process that is oriented, whereas health is more as a state of being. For example, the National Wellness Institute defines wellness as an active process through which people become aware of and make choices toward a more successful existence. So, even just thinking about what it means to be well. So, in order for me to be whole, which is also interchanged sometimes with well, it says that it's an active process. So, that is telling me that wholeness requires me to do something. And I know I'm coming at you right out the gate. Wholeness. In order for me to be whole, there are things that I have to do. I have to be active in the process if I am on this journey to wholeness. Wellness is somewhat a broader term that generally includes both physical and mental. right? So when it says that I hope that you are, that you may be in good health as it goes well with your soul. So we're talking about that you may be well. We're talking about what it means to have wellness. So when we talk about wellness, it's also our physical being, but it's also our mental being, right? So this is why it's so important that you understand what it means to be whole, what it means to be well. But then it also includes the dimensions of our spirituality. So when it says that I hope that all goes well with you and that you may be well in your soul, he's also indicating when it comes to our soul is our mind, our will, and our emotions. And we'll get into that. So if a person can be well, right, we also know that they can be whole or complete. So if I am well, I am also whole, I am also complete. But if I am unwell, right, if I'm unwell, that also means that I am now fragmented or I'm incomplete. Typically, when we use the term wholeness, it can also refer to health. If a person is not whole, then they can also be unwell. So, what are words that you think about when you think about a person being unwell, right? So, you may think of an illness, sickness, unhealthiness, unsoundness, which we think a lot of times when we hear the word soundness, we think about our mind. So, you can be unsound in your mind, which is what? A mental illness. There's disease, disorders, feebleness, frailness, a malady, weakness, ailment, infirmity, or unwholeness. So we gave a foundation or a framework for what it means to be whole. So now let's put it together and look at what inner healing refers to. Inner healing refers to being set free from the negative emotional effects of harmful experiences. It is about restoration of the soul. Inner healing is about restoration of the soul. The soul is comprised, like I said earlier, of your mind, your will, and your emotions. So let's break that down. Your mind is a part of your soul that knows, considers, and remembers. Psalm 139:14 says, your works are wonderful, and my soul knows it well. So, what is he talking about? Knows. He's talking about that part of the soul that's connected to the mind. My soul knows it well. Also, in Lamentations 3:1, Jeremiah shares the affliction of Israel, and he laments, which means he has grief or sorrow. And I'm going to be reading from the Amplified Version. This is Jeremiah 3:1, and it's a lengthy scripture. We're going to read all the way down to verse 22. And it says, I am the man who has seen affliction. Because of the rod of his wrath, he has led me and made me walk in darkness and not in light. Surely he has turned his hand against me. Repeatedly all the day, he has caused my flesh and my skin to waste away. He has shattered my bones. He has besieged and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. He has made me live in dark places, like those who have long been dead. He walled me in so that I cannot get out. He has weighted down my chain. Even when I cry out and shout for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with cut stone. He has made my paths crooked. He is to me like a bear lying in wait and like a lion hiding in secret places. He has turned aside my ways and torn me into pieces. He has made me desolate. He has bent his bow and set me as a target for the arrow. He has caused the arrows of his quiver to enter into my inner parts. I have become the object of ridicule to all of my people and the subject of their mocking song all the day. He has filled me with bitterness. He has made me drunk with wormwood. He has broken my teeth with gravel. He has covered me with ashes and made me cover in dust. My soul has been cast far away from peace. I have forgotten all happiness. So I say, my strength has perished, and so has my hope and expectation from the Lord. Hope of relief in God's mercy. Remember, O Lord, my affliction and my wandering, the wormwood and the gall, bitterness. Verse 20. My soul continually remembers them and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, therefore I have hope It is because of the Lord's loving kindness. So this is Jeremiah. Jeremiah is in the middle of affliction. He is grieving. Grief affects the soul. So this is a perfect example of what somebody with a wounded soul. This is what it looks like. This is what it feels like when someone is experiencing a wounded soul. So now what is healing? Through divine intervention, as in response to prayer, or as in because of faith. So, in order for there to be healing, right, there must have first been a wound or an area of unwellness. So, let's talk about something just for a second. I'm going to ask you a question. Did you know that it is possible to be born with a wounded soul? Think about that for a minute. Is it possible for a person, an individual, they enter into this earth with their soul already wounded? So let me give you a little bit of psychology to help you understand. So as a fetus grows, right? A fetus is growing in the mother's womb. It is constantly getting messages from its mother. It is not just hearing the heartbeat and whatever music she might be playing in her belly. It also gets chemical signals throughout the placenta. A new study, which was published in Psychology Science, a journal of the Association for Psychological Science, finds that this includes signals about the mother's mental state. So, for example, if the mother is depressed, that affects how the babies develop after birth. It did not say that it affects how the baby is developing in utero. This study shows that if a mother is actively depressed, she's experiencing depressive symptoms, which means she has a decrease in her serotonin. If she is depressed while she's carrying that uterus, it's saying that those signals, those chemicals are now passed on to that unborn fetus, and it will later affect the baby after it's born. Second part, in studies on pregnant women, intense stress has been defined to include the following: the loss of a loved one, so that means she may have been grieving, war, catastrophes, interpersonal violence, or these are all traumas that the mother has experienced. These stresses have been linked to subsequent miscarriage, prematurity, low birth weight, right? But stress that is chronic. So, again, this is a mother that's carrying a fetus. And the question that I ask you: is it possible for a person to be born with a wounded soul? I'm giving you psychological evidence that it is possible, that a person can be born with their soul already wounded. So, stress that is chronic, like poverty, homelessness, racism, discrimination, can lead to a low birth weight, as well as later physical and psychological problems. Babies whose mothers experience these kind of toxic levels of stress while pregnant, statistically more likely to have digestive problems. Now, these are physical issues that baby now has as it develops. So they can have respiratory issues, digestive problems, irritability, sleep issues, and this is during the first 3 years. They are also more apt, which means they are more likely to experience developmental problems with cognitive, behavioral, social, emotional, and health issues that suggest neurodevelopment changes that ripple into adolescence and adulthood, right? So it is possible to have been wounded as well at a phase in life and not know it. So let's just go back and talk just a little bit, just to get you to understand how a person can be born with a wounded soul, our mind, our will, and our emotions. And so, again, given the example, if a woman is pregnant and maybe she's depressed, or maybe she experiences something very, very traumatic, her body is now consistently and constantly sending signals to that fetus, right? Regarding the ability to attach. And we'll do a whole talk about reactive attachment disorder and how that inability for the mother to connect with that child can create attachment issues later in life. And so, what about if you have a mother, right, who's pregnant with a child and maybe she doesn't want that child? What signals or what type of chemical responses is now being communicated to that child, right? So that child may be born with feelings of rejection because the mother was unable to connect while she was carrying it. And so now you were wounded in utero and you're born with this rejection complex, right? Like you just feel rejected. And maybe you don't even know why you struggle with feeling accepted. It could trace all the way back to whatever feelings your mother may have been experiencing when she carried you. And so she passed that down. But also, we know that a lot of times when it comes to different mental disorders or anything that can be passed down through your bloodline, through your genealogy, sometimes there also could be generational curses that are also passed down. So you just kind of have to be willing to go through a process of healing, but also sometimes a process of deliverance to make sure that you're addressing both, because deliverance doesn't necessarily clean up the residue that has occurred through a process that only healing, inner healing, can affect. And at the same time, inner healing doesn't necessarily have the ability to address something that's demonic or spiritually inclined. So they're not the same. And sometimes, most cases, we need both. So it is also possible to have been wounded at a phase in life and not know it. And so if you listen to any of my previous videos, like I said, in the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about the stages of psychological development. And on one of my videos, I talked to you about Erik Erikson, who was a well-known psychologist during like the 1950s, 1960s. And he discussed how at different stages, depending on where we are in our psychological development, it can affect how we grow into adults depending on where we were wounded. And so wounds can occur during certain phases of development, and they can hold that person hostage at that stage. So that is at times where you may see an individual who, like, they seem stuck. You're like, man, why won't you grow up? I can't believe that you are, you know, you're 40 and you still want to play video games. And not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but when it becomes like maybe interfering with their ability to get a job, if it's interfering with their ability to make other forms of connections, it may be that they were wounded at a certain stage in life and they became stuck. It's called arrested development. So because they were wounded, maybe through trauma or during other experiences, it stunted their emotional growth. We'll do another video about emotional IQ. And so looking at them, we would think that their emotional age or their emotional IQ would be that of somebody who's 40. But in reality, if they were wounded at the age of 6 or 7, it stunted their emotional growth. They have a lower emotional IQ. And so a lot of times the behaviors that they display are now childish. And it is that so because on the inside they are still childish. That inner child within them is still there because it wasn't healed. It was wounded. And so a lot of times what you see is when they're coping with stress and when they're coping with different life events, they revert back to that inner child who's still living very much on the inside of them, and that's their way of coping. So that's a lot of times where you see people who seem very immature for their age. It's because they were probably wounded, and because of that woundedness during a different stage of their growth, it left them stunted emotionally. In Erikson's view, these conflicts are centered on either developing psychological quality or failing to develop that quality. So, one or two things are going to happen at each psychological stage. If everything is going well, then you have the ability to grow and develop that emotional IQ or get what you need from that emotional stage. Or if something happens that prevents you from growing emotionally and also developing psychologically, then it means that you failed to acquire the skills that you need at that stage. During these times, the potential for personal growth is high, but so is the potential for failure. If people successfully deal with their conflict or wounds, they emerge from the stage with psychological strengths that will serve them for the rest of their lives. If they fail to deal effectively with these internal conflicts, they may not develop the essential skills needed for a stronger sense of self. And I'm not going to go over all of these in depth, but the stages are trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, identity versus confusion, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, integrity versus despair, and support versus criticism. If you want to hear about those in depth, definitely check out my page where we talked about inner healing. There's a couple of other videos posted and you can find it there. But if you have difficulty kind of finding the exact video, just comment on this video and I can tag you in it. So, what exactly is a wound? A wound. So, the definition of a wound is an injury to the body, as from violence, accident, or surgery that typically involves laceration or breaking of a membrane, such as the skin, and usually damages to underlying tissues. Or it can be an emotional hurt or blow. We're talking about what is a wound. A wound can also be a mental or emotional hurt or blow. So let's talk about types of wounds. So when we think about wounds, they can be psychological, which means that it can affect how I think. If I'm wounded psychologically, now my whole perception, the way that I perceive has been altered because I've been damaged in places of my mind. Wounds can also be emotional in that they can affect how I feel. Wounds can also be spiritual. And so if I'm wounded spiritually, that affects now how I see God. Wounds can be caused by the words or actions of others, but can also be inflicted by self. And we'll talk a little bit about self inflicted wounds. So let's go back and just kind of review these just for a little bit. So, psychological wounds, it affects how I think. And so, when I grew up, it was this phrase, it was like sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me. Can I tell you that was a lie? And if you lived long enough, you know that words hurt. Words hurt. Words have the ability to hurt to the point that you get stuck there, right? That's how it can affect the way that I think. So, an example of a psychological wound, I think about kids that are bullied. Bullying is a psychological wound in that it attacks the person's psyche, their mind, their thoughts, everything that's embedded with our intellect. That's what psychological wounds affect. Well, how does that affect the way that I think? Well, if I'm being bullied and somebody is saying, aha, you're fat or you're ugly, I'm either going to be strong enough to rise above that because hopefully I have people around me that are speaking life into me. Like that's why it's so important as parents that we are speaking life into our children, that we are building our children because we may not necessarily know the psychological woundedness that they're encountering at school on a daily basis. And so if I'm told all of these negative things about myself, now I begin to internalize it and I begin to believe what they're saying. Because if they're saying that I'm ugly, well, maybe I am ugly. That's a psychological wound because now it's completely affected how I think. It affects how I view myself, but it also affects how I view the world. Psychological wounds, right? I work with veterans, and many of them have had, very traumatic experiences. But one of the things that many of them can attest to is what's called like psychological warfare. And a lot of times it's seen when people are captive and they are held as prisoners. They get into their head. It's like psychological warfare. They'll do different things in a way to get them to talk about things or to tell secrets. But it's psychological, right? And psychological wounds can be hard to heal from because you begin to see what they see, right? Because if they're saying that there's something wrong with you, instead of us trying to identify what's right with us, now we get on the same path with them, trying to also see what they see. Like it makes no sense when I say it out loud, but I think it's almost human nature. If somebody says, "Oh man, you look like you gained weight," right? That's a psychological wound. You will immediately, if you don't think that you have, now you're self-conscious. You're going home, you're looking in the mirror. Do I look like I gained weight? Maybe I did. And especially for women, that's just like, you don't say that. You don't tell her that she look like she gained weight, even if it's true. But it gets in your head, and that's why it affects the way that you think. A term I don't know if you hear it as much now, is like people playing mind games. They're creating a psychological wound because they realize that in order for somebody to play a mind game, they already know that there has to be an area of weakness and vulnerability that's in your mind already. In order for somebody to try to play with your mind, they've stepped back, they've did an analysis of you, and they've determined that there is a breach, and they have the ability to get inside your head. Right. And so we have to be very mindful about how we portray ourselves. We have to be very mindful about those that we allow in our circle and those that we allow access to us. Because in order for somebody to get inside your head and play a mind game, they have to be in close proximity. Those are typically people that are close around you. But then you have to ask yourself, is there a wound? Is there a psychological wound in my mind that now somebody can come on the scene and have the ability to change what I think? You have to ask yourself, why am I so easily swayed? Why am I so easily moved? Why am I so easily triggered in my thoughts? It could be that there's a psychological wound, right? And we're talking about that from a soul perspective, your mind, your will, and your emotions. But what about spiritually? The devil does the same thing. He tries to get access to your mind. You have to guard your mind. The Bible also says guard your heart. The heart and mind are oftentimes interchanged in the Bible, right? The mind, an idle mind is the devil's workshop. Like there are so many different scriptures that we can look in the Bible that just speaks just to the mind, right? So we have to be intentional about protecting our mind gates. What are you thinking about? The Bible also tells us that so a man thinketh in his heart, but again, interchanged, so is he. So if I have people speaking to me constantly, creating these psychological wounds, and I'm now believing what they're saying, even though what they said wasn't true, I have the ability to make it true, because if I think it, then it's true. So a man thinketh, so is he. So even though what they said is a lie, because they've created a psychological wound, I've convinced myself that what they said must be true. And if what they're saying is true, then what God says about me must be a lie. Who am I talking to? Talking about psychological wounds. What does God say about you? Who does God say that you are? Right? That's what's going to be important. So emotional wounds can be created, like we talked about in some of the other videos and even a little bit earlier today. Emotional wounds can be created through trauma. Like that's more attacking your heart. It's your emotions. It's what you feel. And if we have wounds emotionally, it makes us more emotional. Well, what do you mean? So let me give you an example. I am probably the queen of examples, right? But I'm visual. So I like to give visual examples so that way, hopefully, you can connect to it and it makes sense to you. So here's my visual example of like maybe what a wound looks like. So let's just say you hurt yourself, right? Maybe you had a cut, like you get a cut on your arm. You get cut, which is a wound, right? It bleeds, it looks like it's healed, a couple of weeks go by, it's healed, it's closed over. Well, you're doing something and you brush up against that cut, that wound that's healed, and it hurts. And you're like, man, why does this sore hurt? It's scabbed over. But now that you look at it, it looks kind of dark, right? It's dark. Maybe it's red in the center. Maybe it's a little inflamed, but you thought it was healed because it looked healed. Talking about a wound. So now it hurts. Maybe somebody else brushed up against it. They didn't know you had a wound there. So they accidentally brush up against it. They touch it. So now you mad at them because they hurt a wound that they didn't know was there and you didn't know was there either. Talking about a wound. So you go to the doctor because it's not getting any better. It's actually getting worse. And the doctor looks at the wound and he says, you know what? I think that although it looks healed, you got infection in it. You didn't know that it was infected because it healed. So, what is the doctor going to tell you? If the infection is under the surface, like it's scabbed over, and the infection is down deep, we're going to have to do what? We're going to have to open it up, which is what healing is. Healing is opening all that stuff up. So, he says, in order for this to heal correctly, I'm going to have to open that wound back up, which we know is going to hurt. And not only am I going to have to open it up, now I got to go in and clean out all of the infection. Therapy, healing, deliverance. I got to get in there and I got to clean out all of that infection. And not only do I got to clean out all of that infection, I got to leave it open. You can't put anything on it because in order for it to heal, it has to stay open. See, you made a mistake when you put the Band-Aid on it to try to cover it up because it didn't get air. It didn't get everything that it needed to heal properly. So now the doctor is like, well, this time it's going to heal correctly. So I got to open it up, number one. I got to clean it out. And then you got to let it stay open so that it can heal from the inside out, not just on the outside, right? And so now, because you've gone to therapy, you're maybe more emotional, you're telling people about your traumas. Now you're open and everybody knows about your wound. Or you decided to go down when they had a call for deliverance and everybody saw, the demon manifest, or everybody saw, you throwing up. Like everybody saw this experience that you had that maybe was traumatizing, but everybody knows that you had a wound, right? And so I think sometimes the difficulty in deliverance is that we don't want people to know about our wounds because we've hid them up so carefully. We've been very strategic in how we place our Band-Aid on it, making sure that nobody sees. Or maybe it's just an ugly scar and you keep it covered. So nobody asks questions, nobody sees it. When in fact, in order for it to heal, you got to expose it, right? And so that's why it can be difficult. So what is a spiritual wound? Spiritual wounds typically can look like church hurt, right? I hear that quite a bit where people will be so spiritually injured or spiritually wounded by church, when in fact it's not church. It's the people in the church that hurt us, but hurt people hurt people. And so by them being hurt by people in the church, it creates a spiritual wound. But also, what if you feel that you've been wounded by God? Does God have the ability to create a wound? And I can only speak from my own experience with this, and so I'm not going to necessarily say that God created the wound, but it was a spiritual experience that created a wound for me. So my mother passed away in 2015. And I was so angry at God, right? I was so angry because I'm like, you can save and you can heal everybody else. And I don't ever ask you for nothing. All I want you to do is heal my mom. And he wouldn't do it, right? So for me, that created a spiritual wound and it affected my ability to pray. It affected my ability to talk to God, to be transparent with him because I was so hurt, right? I was angry that he took my mom, right? It was my perspective. But then when I got past being angry and when I was able to go to him about how I was really feeling, he asked me a question. He said, would you still be angry if I answered your mother's prayer? I heard him so clearly. He said, would you still be angry if I chose to honor your mother's prayer and not yours? And I had to think about that for a minute because I don't think it ever dawned on me that maybe my mom was tired, right? Maybe she prayed and asked God to heal her a different way. And so, a lot of times when things happen in life, especially when it's a spiritual experience, we're talking about spiritual wounds. If we're not able to take that thing to God and be able to try to see things from His perspective, it can definitely affect our relationship with Him, and it can affect our ability to move past it. But that's what spiritual wounds looking like. Spiritual wounds can look like you feeling that God didn't honor your prayer, or God let you down, or we can have all of these lists of things that we feel that God didn't do for us, and that can create spiritual woundedness. Or again, the people that we entrust ourselves to spiritually who may have hurt us, and then we in turn see that as a spiritual wound. So the other thing that I talked about was self-inflicted wounds, right? So sometimes there are people that are around us who can create wounds, but what about when we are the ones that create our own wounds, right? Self-inflicted wounds. So, a self inflicted injury is the act of intentionally harming one's own body without meaning for the injury to be fatal. People who engage in self inflicted injury typically do so in an attempt to cope with distress, anger, and other emotional traumas. While self inflicted injury may help people to cope with difficult feelings temporarily, it can cause emotional and physical harm long term. The practice may also have unintended consequences such as severe injury or accidental death. So, when you think about these self inflicted wounds, what does it look like when somebody has a self-inflicted wound? Because we're talking about people in an effort to cope with the wounds that already exist, they now go off and they re-injure themselves, right, in an effort to alleviate the pain. So what do you think of examples of self-inflicted wounds? um, the most often types of self-inflicted wounds that we see are those that manifest physically. Well, Holly, what do you mean? So what about people that eat their emotions? Right? That's a self-inflicted wound. It's a self-inflicted wound in the way that you are eating as a way to cope with your stress. You're eating because that's how you deal with your depression. You're eating because it helps you not feel as anxious for whatever reason. Eating is now your coping skill, right? But what happens if you continue to eat excessively? You're injuring yourself because now maybe your blood pressure's gone up. Like now, maybe you're pre diabetic or diabetic, or you have weight gain, right? And then so it's just like this domino effect where your goal was just to make yourself feel better. Like I don't want to feel this pain. So eating the ice cream makes me feel good, or eating the french fries or whatever your thing is, it helps you feel good in that moment. But you're not calculating the long-term effects of how that self-inflicted wound is going to affect you further. Or what about people that drink or use substances, right, as a way to deal with their pain. So they'll drink their pain away, or they'll smoke their pain away, or people that shoot up drugs, heroin or crack. So they do all of these things in an effort to numb the pain, which again, in the moment, it probably helps them numb it to some degree. But what are the long-term effects? It's a self-inflicted wound. Or what about people who act out physically as a way to numb the pain? Like maybe they're just hopping from bed to bed and they're now using sex as a way to deal with the emotional pain. So, what is a long term effect of that? Well, you could get an STD, not only a sexually transmitted disease, right, but a sexually transmitted demon, right? So it's a self-inflicted wound because you are doing this to yourself. You're doing this to yourself as a way to cope with the wound that was already there. But it doesn't heal the wound, but instead it actually creates new ones. Self-inflicted wounds create an unhealthy pattern of behavior that oftentimes requires deliverance, but deliverance doesn't remove the residue, right? So that's why you have to be mindful about what you're doing to cope. Because people, as a human, we want to move away from pain and towards pleasure. We move away from pain and towards pleasure. But in doing that, like I said, in that process, you're now creating new wounds. All right, so that's self-inflicted wounds. So, how have you coped with wounds to your soul, right? When you realize that your soul is wounded, how have you coped with that? And then the other thing that I've noticed too, and you may have also seen this pattern. So, I love shows that talk about kind of psychology, but also like a person's mindset. So, my two favorite shows probably is Hoarders, because it gives you an in depth look at how severe depression looks. It gives you an in-depth look at how, hopelessness looks when you look at these people who have hoarded all their lives and they just have stuff and they live in these unhealthy conditions. But another show that I watch that is I watch it because it's so insightful to me is My 600 Pound Life. No, My 600 Pound Life. Yes, My 600 Pound Life. And the reason why I watch that is because, when you look at a person who's allowed themselves to get 600, 700 pounds, and they weren't always that way, right? Some of them were chubby as children, but they just like every year they put on like massive amounts of weight to the point that they're bedbound. But what I found, probably 8 out of 10 of those people who are on that show have experienced childhood sexual trauma, childhood sexual abuse. And most of them will say that the reason that I got this big, number one, they found comfort in food growing up, right? So this is a self inflicted wound. They were already wounded by the trauma that they experienced. And as a child, they learned that eating makes me feel good. And unfortunately, sometimes as parents, we don't know or have the emotional IQ to help our children when they've also experienced traumatic things. And so we'll feed them, right? Because we think, well, if food makes me feel good, it'll make you feel good. If a toddler is having a fit, what do? We give them a snack, and they may not even be hungry. So now, unintentionally, we are creating these unhealthy habits in our children. When they're mad, we give them a snack. Regardless of what it is, we make food, candy, or a treat that becomes our way of helping them cope with their emotions instead of sitting them down. Even at the age of 2 or 3, you can sit them down and help them learn how to self soothe without necessarily giving them a pacifier, meaning food or something else to replace what they're experiencing. So, these people on this show, My 600 Pound Life, they have self-inflicted wounds to the point that it's debilitated them, to the point that they're on the verge of death because they're so unhealthy. But it was how they chose to cope with wounds that were created by others. And so that's a great example of what a self-inflicted wound looks like. It is the unhealthy behaviors that I now inflict upon myself as a way to try to minimize or even alleviate the emotional pain that I'm feeling. But as you know, that relief is only temporary. It doesn't get to the root of the issue. And that's how many of them find themselves gaining so much weight, is because once they're hungry again, the pain comes back. And many times too, people that find themselves addicted to substances, whether it's alcohol or other illicit drugs, they didn't necessarily go out wanting to be an addict. Some of them took their first drink or their first hit of whatever it was as a way to deal with their emotional pain, right? And so self-inflicted wounds have long-term effects. People think that their unwellness is who they are. So now that I've been wounded, people will now identify as their wound, like they develop this victim mentality. We accept depression, anger, and even infirmities in our bodies as normal instead of as damaged areas of our soul. We will even take ownership of these defects by using plural possessive pronouns. My depression, my anxiety. And that's something you should never do. And I get many of you maybe struggle with anxiety, but you never claim it as your own, because the Bible teaches us that by his stripes we're already healed. So it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to him. And I get it. Saying that it belongs to him doesn't in that moment take away what you may be experiencing. That's where you got to do the work. You have to be intentional about the work, right? So we can't use plural possessive pronouns, mine, yours. Um, Becoming well can be difficult, and it's also a painful process because you must address the soul, our mind, our will, and our emotions, but you also must address those parts of our spirit that have been damaged, which is that deliverance, but also healing process. Sometimes the wound is so deep that it must be gutted out and healed from the inside. And that goes back to my example how when we have a wound, like an actual flesh wound, and we think that it's healed, but in reality, it's not. And now it has to be opened up because it's been infected. And the only way for it to be healed is not to be healed from the inside out. We oftentimes do a good job looking well on the outside while our soul and our body are unwell. So, what does that look like? We'll dress up our wounds, right? We make sure that our hair is done, we make sure that our nails is done, we look good. But on the inside, we're ugly, we're broken, and we're scattered. So don't let your outward appearance be better than what you look like on the inside, or don't put more effort in trying to fool the rest of the world that you're not addressing your internal wounds. And then a lot of times, too, our soul wounds can manifest as physical illnesses. And so when we think about what does that look like as far as manifesting as a physical illness, so somebody that deals with anxiety, right, that's internal, that may show up as gastrointestinal issues, like they have gut issues, right? Or people that are chronically stressed, it increases cortisol in our stomach. So your stomach can be bigger. It also can increase your blood pressure, right? So these internal issues can also affect you physically. Stress also affects your heart, right? It can increase how your heart is beating, all right? It may be difficult for your heart to pump blood the way that it needs to. So it has other consequences. And so I will leave you with this Psalm 147:3, the Amplified Version. And it says, He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds, healing their pain from comfort and sorrow. And then also Psalm 34. Let's see what we want to read. So when you get time, go and read Psalm 34. It's a Psalm of David. And then it basically starts off where he says, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul, my mind, my will, and my emotions make its boast in the Lord. The humble and downtrodden will hear it and rejoice. So read that in its entirety. And so, again, I just wanted to make sure that I'm continuing this discussion on inner healing, trauma, and the soul. This was part one. So today we just set a foundation of what a wounded soul looks like. Part two, we will be talking about soul wounds, I believe. And so we'll just work a little bit, more into that. I can't remember what part two is. I'll tell you. Let me pull it up just in case you want to make sure you catch the next one. So the next one is the effects of trauma on the soul. Part two is the effects of trauma on the soul. So this one was just inner healing, journey to wholeness. Part two, we're going to talk about the effects of trauma on the soul. All right, so I hope this was helpful. I managed to keep it under an hour. Definitely share this out if you know anybody that might could benefit from just hearing about this. If you have questions, reach out to me. Again, if you'd like to schedule a consult, maybe you're considering therapy and not really sure where to start, there's the information. Check out my website. Hope this is helpful, and I will talk to you guys soon. Be blessed.